On Thursday, the senior pastor of Covenant Christian Center, Poju Oyemade, tweeted a message on faith, and he concluded by urging youth not to waste their enthusiasm on a poorly planned project. He wrote in his tweet, "Faith is not just blind belief or hoping for a miracle. Faith sees, faith has eyes opened and possesses the evidence upon which it builds its belief. Faith prepares long, sometimes for years, just as Joseph did, for the years of famine. Faith counts the cost before embarking." Although Mr. Oyemade's tweet of Thursday made no direct reference to politics, Mr. Obi's supporters descended on the clergyman moments after the tweet appeared. They held the message as a criticism of their campaign for Mr. Obi. Young people, many of them having no contact with the candidate or his party, have been the mainstay of Mr. Obi's campaign thus far. Their vitriol was, as usual, relentless. Even after Mr. Oyemade took down the tweet, the supporters continued to drag him on social media as they gloated over the capitulation of yet another enemy of Mr. Obi. Commenting on the development, Sam Amadi, a lawyer and regular political commentator, wrote on his Facebook page on Saturday, "Pastor Poju was right about the need for rigor and not rhetoric to solve national problems, but they have cancelled him. It is a pattern that has become recurrent and thus disturbing as the 2023 polls approach." 2 weeks earlier, the chaplain of the Adoration Ministry in Enugu, Ejike Mbaka, was hooded by the same group of supporters after a foot in the month remark the cleric made that Mr. Obi will fail in his presidential ambition because he is stingy. Within days of the statement, thousands of Mr. Obi's supporters, who were also followers of the Reverend Father, bragged that they had unfriended him on his social media accounts. Their attacks persisted even after the Catholic Diocese of Enugu disassociated itself from Mr. Mbaka's utterances, before eventually suspending him from all activities of the church. Mr. Mbaka later apologized for his statements. This newspaper, too, has felt the intolerance of the supporters. Shortly after the party primaries, Premium Times had reshared some of its previous investigative reports that indicated 3 of the leading presidential candidates of corruption. The report had earlier been published between September 2020 and October 2021 on the candidate of the All Progressive Congress APC, Bola Ahmed Tinubu, his counterpart of the People's Democratic Party PDP, Atiku Abubakar, and Mr. Peter Obi. None of the politicians challenged the findings of the report, so they were reshared to offer readers glimpses of their past and characters. Although the 3 publications were shared within hours of each other, the supporters of Mr. Obi were the most vicious in attacking this newspaper over a consortium of international journalists finding in the Pandora Papers that he registered secret companies outside Nigeria. The supporters baselessly alleged that the report was done out of bias or inducement, but their attacks have not been for only those who criticize them or their candidates. They also go after Nigerians for merely expressing support for different candidates. Although this is not peculiar to Mr. Obi's supporters, they have taken it to a new low. A day before turning on Mr. Oyemade, they had ignited a controversy by their attacks on some actors who had declared their support for Mr. Tinubu. The actors made their position known in a video clip shared by one of them, Yinka Quadri, that features them taking turns to endorse Mr. Tinubu's candidacy. In this instance, Mr. Obi's supporters accused the actors of giving their support to the APC candidate because he's Yoruba like them or trading it for money. In the controversy that followed on Twitter, a commentator wrote, P-Square are free to support Mr. Obi, it's their right. Yoruba actors and actresses are free to support Tinubu, it's their right. You are equally allowed to support your preferred candidate, it's your right. Don't bully people for their constitutional right. Mr. Obi's presidential aspiration appears to have been appropriated by a social media lynch mob who are attacking his opponents in packs by tyrannizing those who do not share their views. Reno Mokri, a former aide of ex-President Goodluck Ebele Jonathan and campaigner for PDP's Mr. Abubakar last month cried about the incessant verbal abuse he receives from supporters of Mr. Obi. "In my life, I've never been insulted the way at Peter Obi supporters insult me. Yet this same Peter Obi lobbied me when he wanted to be ATIKU'S running mate in 2019. I supported him over others. Yet he watches as his people insult Atiku and I. Nobody knows tomorrow." To be fair to Mr. Obi, he had repeatedly admonished his supporters to stop insulting or attacking his opponents and their supporters. For instance, rather than joining issues with Mr. Mbaka over his remarks on him, the candidate urged his supporters to ease the attack, saying he would meet the cleric over his misgivings. Yet, the illiberalism of his supporters bodes ill for his own ambition and Nigerians' effort at building a democratic culture. Following the attack on the actor supporting Mr. Tinubu last week, some commentators quickly observed the contradiction in attacking the actors when entertainers and other celebrities who are Igbos like Mr. Peter Obi had also been campaigning for him without apology. They also remarked that many of his campaigners on social media are of the same ethnic stock. Nigerians have been trying to escape from the trap of identity politics since it was acknowledged as a big factor in the collapse of the First Republic. In the transition to the Second Republic, the military government tried to ensure that the political parties are national in outlook, although the success of the effort was modest. In the short-lived Third Republic, the military government of Ibrahim Babangida imposed two parties on the country in a futile effort to rebuild Nigerian politics on ideological foundations. Identity politics have also proved very inflammable and lethal in some countries, including Rwanda, Burundi, South Sudan, and defunct Yugoslavia. However, despite the liberal nature of the laws guiding party foundation in Nigeria, politicians have realized that a candidate cannot win the presidency without broad national support, regardless of the level of support the candidate draws from their own part of the country. Mr. Oyemade might well have been alluding to Mr. Obi's supporters in his controversial tweet of Friday, but given his relationship with the candidate and concerns about political development in the country, he might have been giving honest advice through his admonition. Many observers genuinely see the frenzied campaign of his supporters as a sail that will take Mr. Obi nowhere. Until his party builds a structure across the country on which it can compete with the two major parties in a national election, he apparently recognizes this too, as he has been in talks with other parties for an alliance that may help them cover the country. The APC and PDP have party executives in perhaps each of the about 10,000 wards in Nigeria. These officials will mobilize party members and voters in their campaigns across the 774 local government areas of the country and monitor the process in the 178,000 polling units on election days. Without structure in a constituency or area, the party is invisible, however heavy its work may be on social media. In last month's governorship election in Ekiti, the LP was not visible for the reason and returned with an appalling 285 votes from across the 16 local government areas of the state. This is in spite of some Mr. OBI'S most ardent supporters being from the state. This may also be the case in the July 16 governorship election in Osun, where the LP candidate Lasun Yusuf refused to have anything to do with Mr. Obi's social media mobilizers because the presidential candidate himself had not reached out to him. So if Mr. Oyemade intended his message to be applied to the current politics, he probably was advising Mr. Obi and his backers to spare time and energy in the 8 months before the general elections for building the structures their party needs to harness Mr. Obi's seeming popularity and save the hope and enthusiasm of his youthful supporters from ending into a mirage in February 2023. Atiku Abubakar's ecstasy over his victory at the presidential primary of the People's Democratic Party (PDP) has ebbed over cracks. in his party since he picked the Delta State Governor Ifeanyi Okowa as his running mate. Benue State Governor Samuel Ortom confirmed in an interview with Arise Television on Wednesday that the advisory committee the party's leadership and Mr. Abubakar set up for guidance on the peak by 13-4 votes recommended Rivers State Governor Nyesom Wike for the slot. Mr. Wike, who was already aggrieved with the manner in which Mr. Abubakar defeated him at the primary, has refused to take his later disappointment with equanimity. It is a big concern for the PDP and its presidential candidate, realizing that they cannot risk Mr. Wike's wrath going to the elections for many reasons.